All right, y'all. As long as I'm good right here, I'm gonna read another chapter of 100 Years of Solitude. I am on page 120, around there. Yes, 121. The war was over in May, 2 weeks before the government made the official announcement in a high-sounding proclamation which promised merciless punishment for those who had started the rebellion. Colonel Ariano Buendia fell prisoner just as he was about to reach the western frontier disguised as an Indian witch doctor. Of the 21 men who had fallen in the war, 14 fell in combat, 6 were wounded, and only one accompanied him at the moment of final defeat. Colonel Gabriel Marquez, the news of his capture was announced in Macondo with a special proclamation. He's alive, Ursula told her husband. Let's pray to God for his enemies to show him clemency. After 3 days of weeping, one afternoon as she was stirring some sweet milk candy in the kitchen, she heard her son's voice clearly in her car. It was Ariano, she shouted, running toward the chestnut tree to tell her husband the news. I don't know how the miracle took place, but he's alive and we're going to see him very soon. She took it for granted. She had the floors of the house scrubbed and changed the position of the furniture. 1 week later, a rumor from somewhere that was not supported by any proclamation gave dramatic confirmation to the prediction. Colonel Ariano Buendia had been condemned to death and the sentence would be carried out in Macondo as a lesson to the population. One Monday at 10:30 in the morning, Amaranta was dressing Ariana Jose when she heard the sound of a distant troop and the blast of a cornet 1 second before Ursula burst into the room with a shout. They're bringing him now. The troop struggled to subdue the overflowing crowd with their rifle butts. Ursula and Amaranta ran to the corner, pushing their way through, and then they saw him. He looked like a beggar. His clothing was torn, his hair and beard were tangled, and he was barefoot. He was walking without feeling the burning dust, his hands tied behind his back with the rope that a mounted officer had attached to the head of his horse. Along with them, also ragged and defeated, they were bringing Colonel Gabriel Marquez. They were not sad. They seemed more disturbed by the crowd that was shouting all kinds of insults at the troops. My son, Ursula shouted in the midst of an uproar and stabbed a soldier who tried to hold her back. The officer's horse reared, and Colonel Ariano Buendia stopped, tremulous, avoided the arms of his mother, and fixed a stern look on her eyes. Go home, Mama, he said. Get permission from the authorities to come see me in jail. He looked at Amaranta, who stood indecisively 2 steps behind Ursula, and he smiled as he asked her, what happened to your hand? Amaranta raised a hand with the black bandage. They burned, she said, and took Ursula away so that the horses would not run her down. The troop took off. A special guard surrounded the prisoners and took them to the jail at a special guard surrounded the prisoners and took them to jail at a trot, so they ran. They jogged. At dusk, Ursula visited Colonel Oriano Buendia in jail. She had tried to get permission through Don Apolinar Moscote, but he had lost all authority in the face of the military omnipotence. Father Nicanor was in bed with hepatic fever. The parents of Colonel Geronaldo Marquez, who had not been condemned to death, had tried to see him and were driven off with rifle butts, facing the impossibility of finding anyone to intervene. Convinced that her son would be shot at dawn, Ursula wrapped up the things she wanted to bring him and went to the jail alone. I'm the mother of Colonel Oriano Buendia, she announced. The sentries blocked her way. I'm going in any case, Ursula warned them. So if you have orders to shoot, start right in. Start right in. She pushed one of them aside and went into the former classroom where a group of half-dressed soldiers were oiling their weapons. An officer in filled uniform, ruddy-faced with very thick glasses and ceremonious manners, signaled to the sentries to withdraw. I am the mother of Colonel Orleano Buendia, Ursula repeated. You must mean, the officer corrected her with a friendly smile, that you are the mother of Mr. Orleano Buendia. Ursula recognized in his effective way of speaking the languid cadence of the stuck-up people from the highlands. As you say, mister, she accepted, just as long as I can see him. There were superior orders that prohibited visits to prisoners condemned to death, but the officers assumed the responsibility of letting her have a 15-minute stay. Ursula showered him with what she had in the bundle, a change of clean clothing, the short boots that her son had worn at his wedding, and the sweet milk candy that she had kept for him since the day he had sensed his return. She found Colonel Oriana Buendia in the room that was used as a cell, lying on a cot with his arms spread out because his armpits were paved with sores. They had allowed him to shave. The thick mustache with twisted ends accentuated the sharp angles of his cheekbones. He looked paler to Ursula than when he had left. It's a little taller and more solitary than ever. He knew all about the details of the house, Pietro Crespi's suicide, Arcadio arbitrary act and execution, the dauntlessness of Jose Arcadio Buendia underneath the chestnut tree. He knew that Amaranta had consecrated her virginal widowhood to the rearing of Ariano Jose, and that the latter was beginning to show signs of quite good judgment, that he had learned to read and write at the same time he had learned to speak. Well, that's her son. Amaranta had consecrated her virginal widowhood to the rearing of Ariano Jose. She adopted her. learned to speak. From the moment in which she entered the room, Ursula felt inhibited by the maturity of her son, by his aura of command, by the glow of authority that radiated from his skin. She was surprised that he was so well informed. "You knew all along that I was a wizard," he joked, and he added in a serious tone, "This morning when they brought me in, I had the impression that I had already been through all that before. In fact, while the crowd was roaring alongside, he had been concentrating his thoughts, startled at how the town had aged. The leaves of the almond trees were broken, the houses painted blue, then painted red, had ended up with an indefinable coloration. "What did you expect?" Ursula sighed. "Time passes." "That's how it goes," Oriana admitted, "but not so much." In that way, the long-awaited visit, for which both had prepared questions and had even anticipated answers, was once more the usual everyday conversation. When the guard announced the end of the visit, Oriana took out a roll of sweaty papers from under the cot. They were his poetry, the poems inspired by Remedios, which he had taken with him when he left, and those he had written later on during chance pauses in the war. "Remedios didn't end up dying, huh? Promise me that no one will read them," he said. "Light the oven with them this very night," Ursula promised and stood up to kiss him goodbye. "I brought you a revolver," she remembered. Colonel Oriana Buendia saw that the sentry could not see. "It won't do me any good," he said in a low voice, "but give it to me in case they search you on the way out." Ursula took the revolver out of her bodice, B-O-D-I-C-E, and put it under the mattress of the cot. "And don't say goodbye," he concluded with emphatic calmness. "Don't beg or bow down to anyone. Pretend that they shot me a long time ago." Ursula bit her lips so as not to cry. "Don't beg or bow down to anyone. Pretend that they shot me a long time ago." "Put some hot stones on those sores," she said. She turned halfway around and left the room. Colonel Oriana Buendia remained standing, thoughtful, until the door closed, and he lay down again with his arms open. Since the beginning of adolescence, when he had begun to be aware of his premonitions, he thought that death would be announced with a definite, unequivocal, irrevocable signal, but there were only a few hours left before he would die, and the signal had not come. On a certain occasion, a very beautiful woman had come into his camp in Tucurinca and asked the sentry's permission to see him. They let her through because they were aware of the fanaticism of some mothers who sent their daughters to the bedrooms of the most famous warriors, according to what they said, to improve the breed. That night, Colonel Oriana Buendia was finishing the poem about the man who was lost in the rain when the girl came into his room. He turned his back to her to put the sheet of paper into the locked drawer where he kept his poetry. And then he sensed it. He grasped the pistol in the drawer without turning his head. "Please don't shoot," he said. He turned his back to put the sheet of paper. Okay, they let her through because they were aware of the fanaticism. That night, Colonel was finishing the poem about the man who lost the rain, and the girl came in. He turned his back. So he thinks it's somebody else. "Please don't shoot," he said. When he turned around holding his pistol, the girl had lowered hers and did not know what to do. And that way, he had avoided 4 out of 11 traps. In that way. On the other hand, someone who was never caught entered the revolutionary headquarters one night in Manar and stabbed to death his close friend, Colonel Magnifico Visbal. On the other hand, someone who was never caught entered the revolutionary headquarters one night in Manar and stabbed to death his close friend, Colonel Magnifico Visbal, to whom he had given his cot so that he could sweat out a fever. A few yards away, sleeping in a hammock in the same room, he was not aware of anything. His efforts to systematize his premonitions were useless. They would come suddenly in a wave of supernatural lucidity, like an absolute and momentanious momentaneous conviction. A momentaneous conviction. But they could not be grasped. On occasion, they were so natural that he identified them as premonitions only after they had been fulfilled. Frequently, they were nothing but ordinary bits of superstition, but when they condemned him to death and asked him to state his last wish, he did not have the least difficulty in identifying the premonition that inspired his answer. "I'll ask the sentence be carried out in Macondo," as he said. The president of the court-martial was annoyed. "Don't be clever, Buendia," he told him. "That's just a trick to gain more time. If you don't fulfill it, that will be your worry," the colonel said, "but that's my last wish." Since then, the premonitions had abandoned him. The day when Ursula visited him in jail, after a great deal of thinking, he came to the conclusion that perhaps death would not be announced that time because it did not depend on chance, but on the will of his executioners. He spent the night awake, tormented by the pain of his sores. A little before dawn, he heard steps in the hallway. "They're coming," he said to himself. For no reason, he thought of Jose Ocardio Buendia, who at the moment was thinking about him under the dreary dawn of the chestnut tree. He did not feel fear or nostalgia, but an intestinal rage at the idea that this artificial death would not let him see the end of so many things that he had left unfinished. The door opened as a sentry came in with a mug of coffee. On the following day at the same hour, he would still be doing what he was then, raging with the pain in his armpits, and the same thing happened. On Thursday, he shared the sweet milk candy with the guards and put on his clean clothes, which were tight for him, and the patent leather boots. By Friday, they still had not shot him. Actually, they did not dare carry out the sentence. The rebelliousness of the town made the military men think that the execution of Colonel Moreno Buendia might have serious political consequences, not only in Macando, but throughout the area of the swamp. So they consulted the authorities in the capital of the province. On Saturday night, while they were waiting for an answer, Captain Rogue Carnicero went with some other officers to Catarino's place. Only one woman practically threatened, dared take him to her room. Only one woman practically threatened, dared take him to her room. They don't want to go to bed with a man they know is going to die, she confessed to him. You know, no one knows how it will come, but everybody's going around saying that the officer who shoots Colonel Orellano Buendia and all the soldiers in the squad, one by one, will be murdered with no escape sooner or later, even if they hide at the ends of the earth. Captain Roque Carnicero mentioned it to the other officers, and they told their superiors on Sunday, although no one had revealed it openly, although no action on the part of the military had disturbed the tense calm of those days. The whole town knew that the officers were ready to use any manner of pretext to avoid responsibility for the execution. The official order arrived in the Monday mail. The execution was to be carried out within 24 hours. That night, the officers put 7 slips of paper into a cap, and Captain Roque Carnicero's unpeaceful fate was foreseen by his name on the prize slip. Bad luck doesn't have any chinks in it, he said with deep bitterness. I was born a son of a bitch, and I'm going to die a son of a bitch. At 5 in the morning, he chose a squad by lot, formed it in the courtyard, and woke up the condemned man with the premonitory phrase, "Let's go, Buendia," he told him. "Our time has come." "So that's what it was," the colonel replied. "I was dreaming that my swords had burst." Premonitory. Rebecca Buendia got up at 3 in the morning when she learned that Orellano would be shot. She stayed in the bedroom in the dark, watching the cemetery wall through the half-open window as the bed on which she sat shook with Jose Arcadio snoring. She had waited all week with the same hidden persistence with which... That's his sister, Rebecca. No, Rebecca's the girl that they adopted, remember? Like his sister. She had waited all week with the same hidden persistence with which, during different times, she had waited for Pietro Crespi's letters. "They won't shoot him here," Jose Arcadio told her. "They'll shoot him at midnight in the barracks so that no one will know who made up the squad, and they'll bury him right there." Rebecca kept on waiting. "They're stupid enough to shoot him here," she said. She was so certain that she had foreseen the way she would open the door to wave goodbye. "They won't bring him to the streets," Jose Arcadio insisted. With 6 scared soldiers and knowing that the people are ready for anything, indifferent to her husband's logic, Rebecca stayed by the window. "You'll see that they're just stupid enough," she said. On Tuesday at 5 in the morning, Jose Arcadio had drunk his coffee and let the dogs out when Rebecca closed the window and held on to the head of the bed so as not to fall down. There, they're bringing him," she sighed. "He's so handsome." Jose Arcadio looked out the window and saw him, tremulous in the light of dawn. He already had his back to the wall, and his hands were on his hips because the burning knots in his armpits would not let him lower them. "A person fucks himself up so much," Colonel Orellano Buendia said. Fucks himself up so much just so that 6 weak fairies can kill him and he can't do nothing about it." He repeated it with so much rage that it almost seemed to be fervor, and Captain Roque Carnicero was touched because he thought he was praying. When the squad took aim, the rage had materialized into a vicious and bitter substance that put his tongue to sleep and made him close his eyes. Then the aluminum glow of the dawn disappeared, and he saw himself again in short pants, wearing a tie around his neck, and he saw his father leading him into the tent on a splendid afternoon, and he saw the ice. When he heard the shout, he thought that it was a final command to the squad. He opened his eyes with a shudder of curiosity, expecting to meet the incandescent trajectory of the bullets, but he only saw Captain Roque Carnicero with his arms in the air and Jose Arcadio crossing the street with his fearsome shotgun ready to go off. "Don't shoot," the captain said to Jose Arcadio. "You were sent by divine providence." "Don't shoot," the captain said to Jose Arcadio. "You were sent by divine providence." Another war began right there. Captain Roque Carnicero and his 6 men left with Colonel Orellano Buendia to free the revolutionary general Victorio Medina. Another war began right there. Another war began right there. Captain Roque Carnicero and his 6 men left with Colonel Orellano Buendia to free the revolutionary general Victorio Medina, who had been condemned to death in Rio Jaca. They thought they could save time by crossing the mountains along the trail that Jose Arcadio Buendia had followed to found Macando. Before a week was out, they were convinced that it was an impossible undertaking, so they had to follow the dangerous route over the outcroppings with no other munitions but what the firing squad had. They would camp near the towns, and one of them, with a small goldfish in his hand, would go in disguise in broad daylight to to contact the dormant liberals, who would go out hunting on the following morning and never return. When they saw Rio Jaco from a ridge in the mountains, General Victorio Medina had been shot. Colonel Orieno Buendia's men proclaimed him chief of the revolutionary forces of the Caribbean coast with the rank of general. He assumed the position but refused a promotion and took the stand that he would never accept it as long as the conservative regime was in power. At the end of 3 months, they had succeeded in arming more than 1,000 men, but they were wiped out. The survivors reached the eastern frontier. The next thing that was heard of them was that they had landed on Cabo de la Vela, coming from the smaller islands of the Antilles, and a message from the government was sent all over by telegraph and included in jubilant proclamations throughout the country announcing the death of Colonel Orieno Buendia. But 2 days later, a multiple telegram, which almost overtook the previous one, announced another uprising on the southern plains. That was how the legend of the ubiquitous Colonel Aureliano Buendia began. Simultaneous and contradictory information declared him victorious in Villanueva, defeated in Guacamaya, devoured by Motilon Indians, dead in the village in the swamp, and up in arms again in Urumita. The liberal leaders who at the moment were negotiating for anticipation in the Congress branded him an adventurer who did not represent the party. The national government placed him in the category of a bandit and put a price of 5,000 pesos on his head. After 16 defeats, Colonel Aureliano Buendia left Guajira with 2,000 well-armed Indians in the garrison, which was taken by surprise as it slept. Abandoned Rio Jaco, he established his headquarters there and proclaimed total war against the regime. The first message he received from the government was a threat to shoot Colonel Gabriel Marquez within 48 hours if he did not withdraw with his forces to the eastern front. Colonel Rogue Garnicero, who was his chief of staff then, gave him the telegram with a look of consternation, but he read it with unforeseen joy. "How wonderful," he exclaimed. "We have a telegraph office in Macondo now." His reply was definitive. In 3 months, he expected to establish his headquarters in Macondo. If he did not find Colonel Gabriel Marquez alive at the time, he would shoot out of hand all the officers he held prisoner at that moment, starting with the generals, and he would give orders to his subordinates to do the same for the rest of the war. 3 months later, when he entered Macondo in triumph, the first embrace he received on the swamp road was that of Colonel Herinaldo Marquez. The house was full of children. Ursula had taken in Santa Sofia de la Piedad with her older daughter and a pair of twins who had been born 5 months after Ricardo had been shot. Contrary to the victim's last wishes, she baptized the girl with the name Remedios. I'm sure that was what Arcadio meant, she alleged. "We won't call her Ursula because a person suffers too much with that name." The twins were named Jose Arcadio II and Aureliano II. Amarenta took care of them all. She put small wooden chairs in the living room and established a nursery with other children from neighboring families. When Colonel Orieno Buendia returned in the midst of exploding rockets and ringing bells, a children's chorus welcomed him to the house. Orieno Jose, tall like his grandfather, dressed as a revolutionary officer, gave him military honors. Not all the news was good. A year after the flight of Colonel Orieno Buendia, Jose Arcadio and Rebecca went to live in the house Arcadio had built. No one knew about his intervention to halt the execution. In the new house, located on the best corner of the square in the shade of an almond tree that was honored by 3 nests of red breasts with a large door for visitors and 4 windows for light, they set up a hospitable home. Rebecca's old friends, among them 4 of the Moscote sisters who were still single, once more took up the sessions of embroidery that had been interrupted years before on the porch with the begonias. Jose Arcadio continued to profit from the usurped lands, the title to which was recognized by the conservative government. Every afternoon he could be seen returning on horseback with his hunting dogs and his double-barreled shotgun and a string of rabbits hanging from his saddle. One September afternoon, with the threat of a storm, he returned home earlier than usual. He greeted Rebecca in the dining room, tied the dogs up in the courtyard, hung the rabbits up in the kitchen to be salted, and went to the bedroom to change his clothes. Rebecca later declared that when her husband went to the bedroom, she was locked in the bedroom and did not hear anything. It was a difficult version to believe, but there was no other more plausible, and no one could think of any motive for Rebecca to murder the man who had made her happy. That was perhaps the only mystery that was never cleared up in Macondo. As soon as Jose Arcadio closed the bedroom door, the sound of a pistol shot echoed through the house. A trickle of blood came out under the door, crossed the living room, went out into the street, continued on in a straight line across the uneven terraces, went down steps, climbed over curbs, passed along the street of the Turks, turned a corner to the right and another to the left, made a right angle at the Buendia house, went in under the closed door, crossed through the parlor, hugging the wall so as not to stain the rugs, went on to the other living room, made a wide curved to avoid the dining room table, went along the porch with the begonias, and passed without being seen under Almaneta's chair. She gave an arithmetic lesson to Ariana Jose and went through the pantry and came out to the kitchen where Ursula was getting ready to crack 36 eggs to make bread. Holy Mother of God, Ursula shouted. She followed the thread of blood back along its course, and in search of its origin, she went through the pantry along the begonia porch where Ariana Jose was chanting that 3 plus 3 is 6, 6 plus 3 is 9. She crossed the dining room and the living rooms and followed straight down the street. As she turned first to the right and then to the left to the street of the Turks, forgetting that she was still wearing her baking apron and her house slippers, and she came out into the square and went to the door of a house where she had never seen, and she pushed open the bedroom door and was almost suffocated by the smell of a burned gunpowder, and she found Jose Arcadio lying face down on the ground on top of the leggings he had just taken off, and she saw the starting point of the thread of blood that had already stopped flowing out of his right ear. They found no wound in his body, nor could they locate the weapon, nor was it possible to remove the smell of powder from the corpse. First they washed him 3 times with soap and a scrubbing brush. Then they rubbed him with salt and vinegar, then with ashes and lemon, and finally they put him in a barrel of lye and let him stay for 6 hours. They scrubbed him so much that the arabesques, ARABESQUES, of his tattooing began to fade. When they thought of the desperate measure of seasoning him with pepper, cumin seeds, cumin seeds, and laurel leaves, and boiling him for a whole day over a slow fire, he had already begun to decompose, and they had to bury him hastily. They sealed him hermetically in a special coffin 7.5 feet long and 4 feet wide, reinforced inside with iron plates and fastened together with steel bolts, and even then the smell could be perceived on the streets through which the funeral procession passed. Father Nick Cantor, with his liver enlarged and tight as a drum, gave him his blessing from bed, although in the months that followed them reinforced the grave with walls about, between which they threw compressed ash, sawdust, and quicklime, and cemeteries still smelled of powder for many years after, until the engineers from the banana company covered the grave over with a shell of concrete. As soon as they took the body out, Rebecca closed the doors of her house and buried herself alive, covered with a thick crust of disdain that no earthly temptation was ever able to break. She went out into the street, and on one occasion, when she was very old, with shoes the color of old silver and a hat made of tiny flowers, during the time that wandering Jew passed through town and brought on a heat wave that was so intense that birds broke through the window screens to come to die in the bedrooms. The last time anyone saw her alive was when with one shot she killed a thief who was trying to force the door of her house. Except for Argenita, her servant and confidante, no one ever had any more contact with her after that. At one time it was discovered that she was writing letters to the bishop, whom she claimed as a first cousin, but it was never said whether she received any reply. The town forgot about her. In spite of his triumphal return, Colino Oriana Buendia was not enthusiastic over the looks of things. The government troops abandoned their positions without resistance that aroused an illusion of victory among the liberal population that it was not right to destroy, but the revolutionaries knew the truth. Colonel Oriana Buendia better than any of them. I think he's the youngest son, huh? Although at that moment he had more than 5,000 men under his command and held 2 coastal states, he had the feeling of being hemmed in against the sea and caught in a situation that was so confused that when he ordered the restoration of a church steeple, which had been knocked down by army cannon fire, Father Nicanor commented from his sick bed, "This is silly. The defenders of the faith of Christ destroyed the church, and the Masons ordered it rebuilt." Looking for a loophole through which he could escape, he spent hours on end in the telegraph office conferring with the commanders of other towns, and every time he would emerge with the firmest impression that the war was at a stalemate. When news of the fresh liberal victories was received, it was celebrated with jubilant proclamations, but he would measure the real extent of them on the map and could see that his forces were penetrating into the jungle, defending themselves against malaria and mosquitoes, advancing in the opposite direction from reality. "We're wasting time," he would complain to his officers. "We're wasting time while the bastards in the party are begging for seats in Congress." Lying awake at night, stretched out on his back in a hammock in the same room where he had awaited death, he would evoke the image of lawyers dressed in black, leaving the presidential palace in the icy cold of early morning with their coat collars turned up about their ears, rubbing their hands, whispering, taking refuge in dreary early morning cafes to speculate over what the president had meant when he said yes, or what he had meant when he said no, and even to imagine what the president was thinking when he said something quite different. As he seized away from mosquitoes at a temperature of 95 degrees, or as he chased away mosquitoes at a temperature of 95 degrees, feeling the approach of the fearsome dawn when he would have to give his men the command to jump into the sea. One night of uncertainty, when Pilar Tenero was sinking in the courtyard with the soldiers, he asked her to read the future on the cards. "Watch out for your mouth" was all that Pilar Tenero brought out after spreading and picking up the card 3 times. "I don't know what it means, but the signs are very clear. Watch out for your mouth." 2 days later, someone gave an orderly a mug of black coffee an orderly and a mug of black coffee, and the orderly passed it on to someone else, and that one to someone else until hand to hand it reached Colonel Ariano Buendia's office. He had not asked for any coffee, but since it was there, the colonel drank it. He had a dose of Nux vomica strong enough to kill a horse. When they took him home, he was stiff and arched, and his tongue was sticking out between his teeth. Ursula fought against death over him. After cleaning out his stomach with emetics, she wrapped him in hot blankets and fed him egg whites for 2 days until his harrowed body recovered its normal temperature. On the 4th day, he was out of danger. Against his will, pressured by Ursula and his officers, he stayed in bed for another week. Only dead did he learn that his verses had not been burned. I didn't want to be hasty, Ursula explained to him. That night when I went to light the oven, I said to myself that it would be better to wait until they brought the body. In the haze of convalescence, surrounded by Remedio's dusty dolls, Colonel Ariano Buendia brought back the decisive periods of his existence by reading his poetry. He started writing again for many hours, balancing on the edge of the surprises of a war with no future. In rhymed verse, he resolved his experience on the shores of death, and his thoughts became so clear that he was able to examine them forward and backward. One night, he asked Colonel Gabriel Marquez, "Tell me something, old friend. Why are you fighting?" "What other reason could there be?" Colonel Granado answered. "For the great Liberal Party." "You're lucky because you know why," he answered. "As far as I'm concerned, I come to realize only just now that I'm fighting because of pride." "That's bad," Colonel Gabriel Marquez said. Colonel Ariano Buendia was amused at his alarm. "Naturally," he said, "but in any case it's better than not knowing why you're fighting." He looked him in the eyes and added with a smile, "Or fighting like you for something that doesn't have any meaning for anyone." His pride had prevented him from making contact with the armed groups in the interior of the country until the leaders of the party publicly rectified their declaration that he was a bandit. He knew, however, that as soon as he put those scruples aside, he would break the vicious circle of war. Convalescence gave him time to reflect. Then he succeeded in getting Ursula to give him the rest of her buried inheritance and her substantial savings. He named Colonel Gabriel Marquez civil and military leader of Macondo, and he went off to make contact with the rebel groups in the interior. Colonel Gabriel Marquez was not only the man closest to Colonel Ariano Buendia, but Ursula received him as a member of the family. Fragile, timid, with natural good manners, he was, however, better suited for war than for government. His political advisors easily entangled him in theoretical labyrinths, but he succeeded in giving Macondo the atmosphere of rural peace that Colonel Ariano Buendia dreamed of, so that he could die of old age making little goldfishes. Although he lived in his parents' house, he would have lunch at Ursula's 2 or 3 times a week. He initiated Oriano Jose in use of firearms, gave him early military instruction, and for several months took him to live in the barracks with Ursula's consent so that he could become a man. Many years before, when he was still almost a child, Gabriel Marquez had declared his love for Amaranta. At that time, she was so illusioned with her lonely passion for Pietro Crespi that she laughed at him. Gabriel Marquez waited. On a certain occasion, he sent Amaranta a note from Joe asking her to embroider a dozen Batiste handkerchiefs with his father's initials on them. He sent her the money. A week later, Amaranta brought the dozen handkerchiefs to him in jail along with the money, and they spent several hours talking about the past. "When I get out of here, I'm going to marry you," Gabriel Marquez told her when she left. Amaranta laughed, but she kept on thinking about him while she taught the children to read. And she tried to revive her juvenile passion for Pietro Crespi. On Saturdays, visiting days for the prisoners, she would stop by the house of Gabriel Marquez's parents and accompany them to the jail. On one of those Saturdays, Ursula was surprised to see her in the kitchen, waiting for the biscuits to come out of the oven so that she could pick the best ones and wrap them in a napkin that she embroidered for the occasion. "Marry him," she told her. "You'll have a hard time finding another man like him." Amaranta feigned a reaction of displeasure. "I don't have to go around hunting for men," she answered. "I'm taking these biscuits to Gabriel because I'm sorry that sooner or later they're going to shoot him." She said it without thinking, but that was the time that the government had announced its threat to shoot Colonel Gabriel Marquez if the rebel forces did not surrender Riojaca. The visit stopped. Amaranta shut herself up to weep, overwhelmed by a feeling of guilt similar to the one that had tormented her when Remedios died, as if once more her careless words had been responsible for her death. Her mother consoled her. She assured her that Colonel Ariano Buendia would do something to prevent the execution and promised that she would take charge of attracting Gabriel Marquez herself when the war was over. She fulfilled her promise before the imagined time. When Gabriel Marquez returned to the house, invested with the new dignity of civil and military leader, she received him as a son. Thought of a delightful bits of flattery to hold him there, and prayed with all her soul that he would remember his plan to marry Amaranta. Her plea seemed to be answered. On the days that he would have lunch at the house, Colonel Gabriel Marquez would linger on the begonia porch playing Chinese checkers with Amaranta. Ursula would bring them coffee and milk and biscuits and would take over the children so that they would not bother them. Amaranta was really making an effort to kindle in her heart the forgotten ashes of her youthful passion. With an anxiety that came to be intolerable, she waited for the lunch days, the afternoons of Chinese checkers, and time flew by in the company of the warrior with the nostalgic name whose fingers trembled imperceptibly as he moved the pieces. But the day on which Colonel Geronaldo Marquez repeated his wish to marry her, she rejected him. I'm not going to marry anyone, she told him, much less you. You love Arellano so much that you want to marry me because you can't marry him. Colonel Geronaldo Marquez was a patient man. I'll keep on insisting, he said. Sooner or later I'll convince you. He kept on visiting the house, shut up in her bedroom, biting back her secret tears. I'm going to have to put her fingers in her ears so as not to hear the voice of the suitor as he gave Ursula the latest war news. In spite of the fact that she was dying to see him, she had the strength not to go out and to meet him. At that time, Colonel Arellano Buendia took the time to send a detailed account to Macondo every 2 weeks, but only once, almost 8 months after he had left, did he write to Ursula. A special messenger brought a sealed envelope to the house with a sheet of paper inside bearing the Colonel's delicate hand. Take good care of Papa because he's going to die. Ursula became alarmed. If Arellano says so, it's because Arellano knows, she said, and he had them help her take Jose Arquedo Buendia to his bedroom. Not only was he as heavy as ever, but during his prolonged stay under the chestnut tree, he had developed the faculty of being able to increase his weight at will, to such a degree that 7 men were unable to lift him, and they had to drag him to the bed. A smell of tender mushrooms, a wood flower fungus of old and concentrated outdoors impregnated the air of the bedroom as it was breathed by the colossal old man, weather beaten by the sun and the rain. The next morning he was not in his bed. In spite of his undiminished strength, Jose Arquedo Buendia was in no condition to resist. It was all the same to him. If he went back to the chestnut tree, it was not because he wanted to, but because of the habit of his body. Ursula took care of him, fed him, brought him news of Arellano, but actually the only person with whom he was able to have contact for a long time was Prudencio Aguilar. Almost pulverized at the time by the decrepitude of death, Prudencio Aguilar would come twice a day to chat with him. They talked about fighting cocks. They promised each other to set up a breeding farm for magnificent birds, not so much to enjoy their victories, which they would not need then, as to have something to do on the tedious Sundays of death. It was Prudencio Aguilar who cleaned him, fed him, and brought him splendid news of an unknown person called Arellano, who was a cardinal in the war. When he was alone, Jose Arquedo Buendia consoled himself with the dream of the infinite rooms. He dreamed that he was getting out of bed, opening the door, and going into an identical room with the same bed, with a wrought iron head, the same wicker chair, and the same small picture of the Virgin Help on the back wall. From that room he would go into another that was just the same, the door of which would open into another that was just the same, the door of which would open into another was just the same, and then another exactly alike, and so on to infinity. He liked to go from room to room, as in the gallery of a parallel mirrors, until Prudencio Aguilar would touch him on the shoulder. Then he would go back from the room to the room. He would go back from room to room, walking in reverse, going back over his trail, and he would find Prudencio Aguilar in the room of reality. But one night, 2 weeks after they took him to his bed, Prudencio Aguilar touched his shoulder in an intermediate room, and he stayed there forever, thinking that it was a real room. On the following morning, Ursula was bringing him his breakfast when he saw a man coming along the hall. He was short and stocky, with a black suit on and a hat that was so black, enormous, pulled down to his taciturn eyes. Good Lord, Ursula thought. I could have sworn it was Malquiadas. It was Cataur, Visitacion's brother, who had left the house fleeing from the insomnia plague, and of whom there had never been any news. Visitacion asked him why he had come back, and he answered her in their solemn language, I come for the exequies of the king. I have come for the exequies, E-X-E-Q-U-I-E-S. E-X-E-Q-U-I-E-S. I have come for the exequies of the king. Then they went into Jose Arquedo Buendia's room, shook him as hard as they could, shouted in his ear, put a mirror in front of his nostrils, but they could not awaken him. A short time later, when the carpenter was taking measurements for the coffin, through the window they saw a light rain of tiny yellow flowers falling. They fell on the town all through the night in a silent storm, and they covered the roofs and blocked the doors and smothered the animals who slept outdoors. So many flowers fell from the sky that in the morning the streets were carpeted with a compact cushion, and they had to clear them away with shovels and rakes so that the funeral procession could pass by. He was the founder of that company. Crazy. That was the end of that chapter. Long chapters. Peace.